So welcome to Politics Chat on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And I'm going to get right to it because I know that nothing is more frustrating than waiting for somebody to start. First of all, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. And I just want to start here by saying something just came across my desk right before I turned this on today that I feel like it's probably worth addressing. And somebody wants to know how I know what's going on in the White House. And the answer to that is I do not. My sources are public sources. I am not a journalist. I do not have inside sources. What I do have is 30 years of experience working around the history of Congress, the executive branch, to a lesser degree, the judicial branch. I know the law basically as a historian knows the law. I am not a lawyer. But so when I say that, for example, that President Biden had a phone call with some leader and that this is what they said, or when I say that Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave a speech or believes this, what I use are public documents. I just know where they are. So it's easy for me, for example, to check Congress's schedule or to check and see what the recent speeches are. That's why I put sources when I write my letters. You can follow where I go, so that you don't have to take what I say at all. You can go check those sources and you can say, hey, that source is wrong. I disagree with that source, but my stuff is not because somebody is whispering things in my ear. What I do, anybody could do if they knew where the sources are. The possible exception to that, of course, is that I do subscribe to a very, very wide range of publications, both through my university and because I invest in them. And that means that I often read papers that perhaps other people wouldn't, in part because you just don't have the disposable income to have that many subscriptions. So so I don't have any inside scoop, and I'm not secretly doing anything that anybody else couldn't do. So don't feel like there's something secret going on here. It's kind of the cool thing about scholars is this is what we do for a living, so we know where things are. So, for example, the story that I think I might pull out tonight is actually from a publication that most people probably doesn't even know exists. It's public, but you got to know where it is. All right, so that out of the way, let me go ahead and somebody said my research ability makes me look like I'm an oracle or a seer. No, that's my research ability, but it's also history. Like that's what historians do. We study how society changes. So I never know what the future is going to be, but I have a good sense of how similar things have played out in the past. It's never exactly the same, but I have a decent sense of what might happen next. And I'm revising that all the time, by the way, so that sometimes it seems like I've got some great foresight. I don't. I have great hindsight, and I just happen to know a lot about the hindsight. All right, so let me get to your questions and get into these. And actually, I'm going to start here with some easy ones to work us into this, and then I'm going to get to the bigger ones. So, for example, somebody asked about whether or not Washington, D.C. should simply be given to Maryland, and is that annexation possible? Well, anything is possible in going forward in our country, but that is a real cop-out to my mind. We have never had, for example, a state receded back into its original state. And what that is when people are calling for giving DC representation by giving it back to Maryland is simply an attempt to recognize the fact that with more than 700,000 people in Washington, D.C., they ought to have a voice in their government. It's bigger than two other states, Vermont and Wyoming. So they recognize that, but they actually don't want to make it a state because with its majority African American population, they expect that it will vote Democratic, and therefore they insist that this is just an attempt to give Democrats more seats. So the people who are saying that are Republicans. And I'm sure if you've been listening to me or reading around, that in fact between 1889 and 1890 the Republicans did precisely that. They added 6 new states to the Union: North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, and Montana, all simply to give themselves a leg up in the Senate and in the Electoral College. And so that's this idea that somehow giving a voice to the and again, Wyoming still doesn't have as many people as DC does all these more than 100 years later. that's really disingenuous, is what it is. And as you know, I keep saying that we have a problem with our mechanics of democracy not currently fitting the people, and we're going to have to do something about that. But the answer is not to invent a sudden, oh, we're going to give DC back to Maryland. That's stupid. All right, so I mean, I shouldn't say that. It was a senator who said that, but don't worry about that. That ain't going to happen. And it shouldn't happen, to my mind, either. That's really ridiculous. If you're going to do that, you better start putting South Dakota and North Dakota back together, and deciding that maybe Idaho and Wyoming need to be pushed back together. And that's not an answer. All right. So somebody else asked, do I think there is a gentleman's agreement, with an eye roll on gentleman, that Biden agreed to let Trump himself off the hook for federal crimes in order for Trump to agree to finally, after 6 dead, allow a peaceful transition of power? And the answer to that is no. I just said I don't know what happens in the White House. I would be shocked beyond belief, in terms of the way people behave, for Biden to have done such a thing, because Biden is a very astute politico. People tend to forget that. He's been around for many, many decades. He knows what he's doing. And the one thing that he really does not do, and I think you can see this in the way he talks and in his behavior and in the behavior of his White House, he is very careful about the lines of legality and propriety within the federal government. So, as you know, one of my favorite stories about this White House is, and maybe you didn't pick this up, but at the end of press conferences, which, by the way, the major media is no longer covering, except in person. They're not televising them the way they televised all of the Trump press conferences. But at the end of those, Jen Psaki does not herself, she's the press secretary, say when they are over. She turns to one of the journalists. There is a head journalist there, and it's the journalists who decide when the press conferences are over. And that's an old tradition that had been completely lost during the Trump White House, and they've brought that back again. And my point here is simply that they're trying to keep the old traditional lines in order. And it was always that the press was respected in the White House as they call it, the fourth estate. And they've brought that back. And it's something that most people, they're not doing it for show. Obviously, most people don't even know that happened. But that being said, there's just no way that Biden would have had made any kind of a deal with Trump. First of all, because it would be wrong, and the lines I think he keeps very clear. But second of all, because as an old politico, he knows that any deal with Trump is not worth the breath that's wasted on it. Anybody who can't see Trump for what he is at this point is simply delusional. And the idea that you would try and make any kind of a bargain with him that lasts, longer than as long as it takes to split a piece of cake and to split it in half, which even that I wouldn't. I think he'd be trying to get the bigger half. I just think Biden wouldn't do that. So if you're hearing that, that's not happening. All right. So now another quick one that I will talk more about in a minute, and that is. Can I tell you what legislation Democrats have passed? So far, is it only executive orders? Okay, so no. So let me make it once again, make this really clear. Executive orders, every president does them, are the way that I think about them is that they are literally like your boss telling you how to carry out something. Like if your company needs to, start a whole new fleet of trucks or something. I don't know. I don't run a company. I'm making this up. But like, okay, that's a great idea. Now, how do you do it? Who does what? Who makes the purchases? Who goes out and test drives the trucks or whatever needs to happen? In order to do that, your boss has to say, hey, Jane, you're driving the trucks. John, you're, doing the paperwork, whatever. The boss decides how that mission is going to be implemented, how you're going to make that happen. And that's what an executive order is. It is the president as the head of the executive branch of government saying, this is how we are going to make this particular piece of legislation play out, or this particular directive play out. And so when Trump got into office, he instantly put in place an executive order that said that we would be building a wall on the border and that Mexico would pay for it. And of course, that actually doesn't happen for a number of months because my daughter is at the windows. I'm sorry? Yeah, you probably should actually, sweetie. But I'll talk to you later. Um, uh, uh, so when Trump gets in office, he instantly puts that order in about the border wall, but he doesn't actually have any money to pay for it, and it's going to take about a year for Congress to get together, its act together, and to put up money for that to happen. So and then again, within a week of him going into office, he then does the executive order for the Muslim, what was known as a Muslim ban. It was the travel ban from 6 primarily Muslim countries, and those are orders. Those were just orders. They weren't laws. They were orders. All right. So it's like your boss telling you what to do. So the first thing that Biden did when he got into office is he went ahead and he signed a whole bunch of executive orders right away, that very first day of his inauguration. And they did a number of things. So for example, they got rid of the 1776 Project, a commission, and took that off the website. And they did a bunch of stuff like that. But that's not legislation. That's only your boss telling you how to implement stuff. So that's not legislation. Congress passes legislation, and that's what somebody asked. Have the Democrats passed any legislation? And yes, they have passed a huge infrastructure bill called the American Rescue Plan. And it passed very, very quickly out of the box, in which what it does is what it did is it put, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was more than $1 trillion into rebuilding the country after the economic crash of the coronavirus. So you may remember in the back of your heads complaints on the Republican side of the aisle that said that not much money was going toward coronavirus itself, which is absolutely right. It was under 9%, I think, or maybe it's around 9%. I don't have the figures in front of me, because the bill wasn't supposed to do that. The bill was supposed to rebuild the economy, which is what it obviously is doing. So that's the one really big piece of legislation they've passed. Now they've proposed other pieces, and those pieces I'm going to tell you just a little bit about, not a lot, but one is a major infrastructure plan bill called the American Jobs Plan. And what that's designed to do is really to rebuild our infrastructure. But there's a big problem, because the Republicans believe that the definition of infrastructure in that is far too broad. So it's got child care proposals in it, for example, which most women and people who take care of children recognize that child care to us really is infrastructure, because you can't live your life without it. But the Republicans are trying to argue that infrastructure is only roads and bridges. And the Democrats are saying, no, it's broadband, it's childcare, it's all those pieces that you now need in the 21st century in order to have a functioning country. And so it may be that they break that package up. Right now, the Senate has passed overwhelmingly by a vote of 98-2 a major infrastructure water bill, which is designed to provide clean water to different cities and to manage the water issues. But the problem at the end of the line for the Democrats, if that happens, is that it's hard to imagine that things like childcare are going to get through, and that's really kind of problematic in the 21st century. So how that's going to play out is not immediately clear. It is interesting that the Senate went ahead and said, yeah, we're willing to spend money on infrastructure of any sort, because they had insisted that they wouldn't do that for a long time. And this was, as I say, overwhelming. It may be that they're trying to undercut the Democrats on some of their most popular bills, because the infrastructure plan is very, very popular, just as the American Rescue Plan was. Now, the other big thing that the Democrats have put forward is called HR1, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and HR1. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry. We're at the end of the semester, so things are vague. Come on, you know what that one is. Somebody put it in the chat, will you? In any case, that's to protect voting rights for everybody, to make it easier to vote, to keep big money out of politics, and to stop gerrymandering. It does a lot of other things as well. It's a more than 700-page document, but that's a really interesting one, because right now, West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin says that he will not get on board that unless some Republicans do, and the Republicans don't want to, because, and I'm going to explain that, today. That's what I really want to get into, because they recognize that if, in fact, we protect the right to vote and we take big money out of politics and we stop gerrymandering, they will never win another election, at least in their current incarnation, where the Democrats recognize that unless we do pass H.R. 1, we the country do pass H.R. 1, that the Democrats will never win another election. And this, I think, is deeply, deeply, deeply problematic. And that's what I want to talk about today. All right. So For the People Act. Thank you, Nancy Jane. It's For the People Act. And actually, I don't know the status of the George Floyd Policing Act. That's another question as well. I'm sorry about that, and I should have put that in the notes as well. I'm sorry. Now you're all saying For the People Act. I got it now. Sorry. I sometimes I just do a complete blank. All right. So now let's get down to the specific questions you asked about today, and I'll do some more of this. Some more of this material that I just covered in what I'm going to say now. People want to know what's going on with Liz Cheney, Elizabeth Cheney, who is a Republican from Wyoming, who has taken since January 6th a very strong stand against Donald Trump and what he tried to do to democracy. And you want to know why she is doing what she's doing. And I'm going to start here by saying that the fact that people are trying to downplay what happened on January 6th is, to me, profoundly troubling. That was an attempted coup, and it came dangerously close to success. And the fact that we are now sort of pretending it didn't happen, and the Washington Post just featured Josh Hawley, Republican senator from Missouri, who egged these people on, and that we're sort of memory holding this is just when I do have insight, I'm telling you, this is a mistake to memory hold this, because we've never had this before, and I'll unpack a little bit what that means. I did write the other night about the big lie, and the attack on January 6th is part and parcel of the big lie. So the big American lie, which, by the way, it appears was coined by Biden. I could be wrong about that. When that's why I didn't write about it. When I tracked it down, it appears he was the first to say that, interestingly enough. But the big lie is that Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election. Let me be very clear. He did, by more than 7 million votes. And similarly in the Electoral College, by a vote of, I believe it's 306 to 232. I believe. Again, those numbers are not immediately in front of me, but by a significant margin. All right. And it's interesting because you're starting to see now on the right people saying that he only won by, a few thousand votes. And what they're doing is they're discounting all those other millions of votes, and they're looking at the swing votes, the smallest number of swing votes for the states he needed, which is really interesting because that is, in fact, precisely how Donald Trump won in 2016. Remember, he lost the popular vote by about 2 million votes. But this is not a close election. This was not a close election. This was not a close election. And then, of course, Trump and a number of his surrogates went on to sue in a number of states, the states where they wanted to be counted in because they could have won in those states if they'd gotten them. And they launched, I believe it was 64 lawsuits, and they lost all but one of them for lack of evidence. So this is not close at all. And the one they won was procedural. It was not about the numbers. It was about where somebody, I believe it was about where somebody could stand as an observer. So they also had recounts in all of those states. And in all of those states, the votes didn't change. Then, of course, what happens is the states in various ways certify those votes. They say this is the real vote. And the reason we do that is because after the election of 1876, when a number of states, 3 states in the South and the one in the West is a little bit different, but the 3 states in the South turned back to the federal government conflicting lists of who won. And the federal government's like, crap, which are we supposed to count, So what they did is they came up with a really clear group of steps. And once the states have signed on and certified the ballots, those are the official count. Now, those, of course, on January 6th went to Congress, and Congress had to count them. They're actually certified, and then they're counted by Congress on January 6th. And that was the stage at which Trump and his supporters got the idea that somehow Mike Pence, as the vice president who was then presiding over a joint session of Congress, could change those votes. He couldn't. He couldn't. He was just supposed to count. And by the way, these are not Democrats counting these in those states. Those are Republicans who did the recounts with Democratic observers. So in Georgia, where Trump got so upset, Brad Raffensperger, who was the Secretary of State of Georgia, is a staunch Republican. So the idea that somehow there was a steal here is just a lie. All right, it's just a lie. And one of the reasons I think that Trump pushed it is that, as we now know, thanks to that wonderful in-depth article from the New York Times, that what the Republicans did is they automatically checked boxes in their fundraising before the election because they were very, very short on money, if you remember that. So they checked all these boxes that said if you made a donation to Trump before the election, you would automatically give every week at that level. People didn't expect that to happen. So they instantly, when they recognized that their bank accounts were being depleted, they challenged those charges, and they won. But they didn't have to pay, the Trump campaign didn't have to pay that money back until after the election, and they raised hundreds of millions of more dollars after the election by claiming that the election had been stolen. So what they did is they basically made themselves a short-term, no-interest loan to get themselves past the election. So they basically ripped off people before the election, and then on the other side of the election, they went ahead and paid it back with money that they raised after the election. And that's never really been done before, because most people don't try to raise money for an election after the election's over. But so that's one of the reasons that happened. But I think we're also going to find that there were other reasons. So for example, if you have been following the Giuliani story and the fact that the Department of Justice under Trump and under William Barr at the time repeatedly refused to let the federal investigators do a search warrant on Giuliani's home and office. What's interesting about that is that it's very hard to get a search warrant for a lawyer at all, because they have attorney-client privilege. You basically have to convince a judge that there has been, you can prove that a crime's been committed and that there will be evidence of that crime where you're searching. And then the next level is that this wasn't any lawyer, this was the president's lawyer. So the evidence appears to be pretty darn strong that Giuliani was up to his neck in probably in this Ukraine thing, although once they've gotten his electronics, who knows what else I suppose might be on there. But the Ukraine scandal, which I've written about really extensively, that's a really big deal. That's a really big deal. And the more stuff that's coming out about that, the worse it looks. So my guess is that, I never understood, if you look back at some of my letters from the campaign, you will see me saying, presidents always want to be reelected. They really always do. I mean, well, unless they've got such a big scandal like LBJ said that they know they can't be. But Trump was weirdly obsessed with having to be reelected. Not just the fact that he tried to twist the arm of Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, but also remember, that's actually, if you remember, that's actually why he was so pro-China at the beginning of 2020, right before the coronavirus really exploded. And we know this from John Bolton's book, that he had actually gone to President Xi and said, you have to buy more American goods because the middle of the country is mad at me about the tariffs. So if you will just buy hundreds of millions of soybeans and the stuff that you haven't been because of the tariff, I'll get reelected. And Bolton recalls this and being horrified, but it worked. I mean, that's why we had that big deal with the Chinese at the beginning of January and early February of 2020. And you may not have put all this together, but if you remember, Trump at that point was talking about how wonderful Xi Jinping was and what a great job they were doing with the coronavirus and how this was all going to be fine, because he had made this deal because he was so desperate to get elected. And like I say, presidents always want to get elected. But really, like that much? I mean, that's way and beyond even what Nixon did. So it was all a little bit weird to me. And my guess is we're going to discover that he was desperate to continue to have control over our judicial system, is the bottom line, is my guess. That's a guess. All right. Um, so all that to say, so they are pushing this lie that he really won. He didn't really win, but he was so determined. And it's also partly his personality. I mean, a personality like his never can handle losing at all. But they actually stormed the U.S. Capitol. And let me be clear about what happened at that U.S. Capitol. So, like people are trying to pretend like it wasn't a big deal. Oh yeah, so some people died, whatever, they tased themselves or whatever. And I said that deliberately flippantly. When you lose lives, it's never a small thing. And the idea that somehow we lost more people in that Capitol riot than we lost in Benghazi, just so you know. And the Benghazi thing is really, really interesting because Benghazi, the people there, some of them are on the CIA's wall. So something was going on there too. Anyway, I'll stop with that. But the idea that somehow we investigated Benghazi, what was it, 8 times? And this is like, oh, never mind. That's a political stance, because think about what happened on January 6th. You're thinking, as I say that, you're thinking about the crowds going in and all that. Think about who is at risk and how rarely all those people are in the same building. That was a joint session of Congress, and the vice president was there because of the counting. So you had the top 3 people who would have taken over the government if something happened to President Trump in the same building at the same time, which almost never happens. And that was, had those people broken in more effectively, had the Capitol Police not been faster, had, all those things that could have gone a different way, we might be having a very different conversation right now. And again, that's, as a historian, this was jaw-dropping, heart-stopping, all of those things. And it is a really big deal and remains a really big deal. It was an attack on our democracy, and it came really close to succeeding. So play that out in your mind. What would have happened? What would have happened if they had broken in and actually gotten their hands on Mike Pence or Nancy Pelosi? Or any of the other people there, Mitt Romney, who came very close to running into them? What would that have looked like? How then would that have played out? And let me tell you, I play that scenario out in my head almost every day, because I don't have all the moving pieces yet. None of us do. They're not there. And I have, as many as are in the public sphere, but there's a lot of moving pieces that have not come out. And when those pieces come out, I think people are going to be appalled by what they see. All right. So all that is a backdrop to what Liz Cheney did. From January 6th on, Liz Cheney said, this is not acceptable. Now, let's not make any mistake that Liz Cheney is a Democrat. She is actually a hard right, almost a libertarian. She is a movement conservative down the line. She's a war hawk. She is really, really hard right. She's not a conservative in any way I would consider her, one of the radical extremists I talk about. But she does recognize a number of things. And one of those things is that if they had succeeded, or let me do the next thing in a second, if they had succeeded, this country would at best be in serious trouble, and at worst not be functioning right now. And that's the part that has me up at night now, because it didn't stop on January 6th. It didn't stop on January 6th. That idea that Trump was cheated has never gone away. And not only Trump, but the majority of Republicans are refusing to come out and call that the lie it was. And that's horrific, because what it's doing is it's stoking a number of fervent Trump supporters to believe that that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president, and that the Democrats have stolen the government. And if that's the case, what is their job then? That worries me a lot. So what Liz Cheney has done And mind you, there's a recent survey says that 70% of Republicans, now again, fewer than 25% of Americans self-identify as Republicans right now. Lots of independents in there. But 70% of them do not believe that Biden is a legitimate president. That's unprecedented. That's just unprecedented in American history. So what she has done is, again, she's no Democrat, but she is stepping up and she's doing something really important, and that is she is calling out the Republican Party for enabling this big lie. Because here's the problem for the Republicans, and again, it's interesting to watch this. Um, um, yeah, I'm seeing. Yeah, okay. I won't comment on that, but I agree with that. So the Republican Party coming out of January 6th, it was not clear what's going to happen because you can see the party splitting, and I've written about this recently too. You can see it splitting. You've got they're all movement conservatives. They're all way far away from the traditional republicanism of Eisenhower and Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Nelson Rockefeller and even George H.W. Bush. They've gone way far to the right from that. But within that faction, now they've split in two. And you've got the business Republicans who love low taxes and they don't want any regulation. They're the Liz Cheneys, if you will. But they do recognize that if the Trumpers take over the party and take over the country, and I'm going to explain that in a second, business is destroyed because you need a stable country to have a stable business community. So the chaos that they are looking at is not good for anybody, which is one of the reasons you see so many businesses saying they're not going to back the people who are enabling this big lie. They don't like the Democrats necessarily, but they don't want a destabilized country. And if you need an example of that, just think about the American South after the 1870s when nobody would invest because they're like, why should we invest when the place is run by a bunch of people who kill you if they don't like you? Because what that means is that business doesn't have a level playing field. Nobody's got a level playing field. It's all a question of whom you know and maybe who you can pay off to do business there. And there's no point in that. We're going to keep our money in the North. And you can expect the same thing to go national in America if the other part of the party takes over. Okay, so here's their problem. These parties split. But the voters, at this point, the Republican Party is hemorrhaging those business voters because the people in the suburbs, that's really where Biden picked up a ton of votes, is in the suburbs. They look at the Trumpers and they're like, those aren't my people. I don't want them to be part of storming the freaking Capitol. I may not want regulation, and I may, want traditional social legislation. I mean, traditional social values to be pushed by legislation, but I don't want to be represented by this guy in bullhorns tearing down the Capitol. That's crazy. I like the government, or not. I like the idea of the American government. So they've been hemorrhaging to Biden, and the problem is that the staunch Republican voters are not Republican voters any longer. They're Trump voters. So the Republican Party has to make a choice. And in the last week or so, it appears they are making that choice. And Kevin McCarthy, for example, originally, remember he was on the phone to Trump during the insurrection, telling him to call his people off. And they actually got into, according to somebody who was there, I don't have inside information, but according to a Republican who was there, they got into a shouting match. And recently when a journalist charged McCarthy to say, was that true or not? He wouldn't answer. So I'm going with probably yeah. But he's come around and he went down to Mar-a-Lago and he's sort of kissing Trump's ring to say, yeah, I need you back because I want to regain power in the House of Representatives. And unless I get more Republicans elected, I can't do that. And the only way I can get them elected is for me to have your voters. So they're not even Republican voters any longer. They're Trump voters. Remember that the Republican Party didn't even bother to have a political platform in 2020. They just said, we'll do whatever Trump wants. And not literally. They kept their old platform from 2016, but it was completely outdated. And they just said, we're happy with the direction the country's going. So at this point, the real question is, Liz Cheney is saying, she is standing up and being in their faces, and she's saying, I'm not going to go with this. I'm not going to go with these people. Unfortunately for the Republican Party, these people are represented by people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, who's in real trouble with this pending problem in Florida with paying for sex with an underage girl. And they're not people that are going to attract voters in the suburbs. And so when this rip apart happens, you can see them trying very hard to shut up Liz Cheney because they don't want a Republican out there calling this out for what it is. And I talk a lot about this with friends, and I have friends on both sides staunchly saying they're gonna replace Liz Cheney as third in the House, and they're not gonna replace Liz Cheney as either she's gonna pull this off or she's not, and people feel very strongly about which is the case. And I'm afraid I'm not convinced on either side. I think we're gonna see how it plays out, but it's a real problem for the Republican Party. So what is happening, and why is she speaking up now? Because, and this is why the Republican Party and the business wing of the Republican Party is concerned, and I don't think I need to say that independents and Democrats are also very concerned, because the Trumpers in the country, there aren't that many of them. They really are not that many of them. There's as I say, 25% of Americans before the insurrection called themselves Republicans. Many more voted Republican, because independence doesn't really mean you're voting for an independent candidate. You swing way or not, one way or another. But the Trump branch of the Republican Party began to take over the state Republican parties even before the election, in part because Trump was concerned that he was going to lose the nomination to a challenger because he was not popular. Remember, that's a president who never broke 50%. Since Gallup began polling, he never broke 50%, which it's never happened before, right? He was not popular. So he was concerned that he was going to get primaried and somebody was going to clean him out. So he went ahead and he took over the state. He put his own people into positions in the state GOP, the state Republican parties. And the problem with that, there's a twofold problem with that, sort of structurally. So structurally, the problem with having him put his own cronies into those positions is that they are not people who are loyal to the organization, because they could not have risen to those positions through the organization for the most part. They got there because of him. So they are very, very loyal to him. Now, the problem is that they are loyal not only to him, but also to the idea that the election was stolen from him. And so we are getting things like this recount in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is being run by a private company, does not have does not have experience doing recounts. They are not permitting oversight. The ballots have not been protected, and most of us expect that they are going to come out and say that the counting, that their recount says Trump won the state. It's not legitimate. I mean, it's really quite literally as if I were telling you how last night's basketball game came out because I counted it. I have no experience scoring a basketball game at all. And you have exactly as much reason to trust me about scoring a basketball game, especially one I didn't attend, as you do trusting these people. But if you really, really, really wanted to believe that your team won a basketball game, you might say, oh, Richardson says, and that's what everybody is afraid is going to happen, is these people are going to come out and say, oh yeah, Trump did win this. And while they are presenting themselves as only wanting to make sure the votes are clean going forward, Trump himself down in Mar-a-Lago has said, this is going to prove I won Arizona. And it's also going to prove that I won the other states and that I really won that election. Now, if he does that, if he can convince his supporters that he in fact won that election and Biden did not, what does that look like after January 6th? That's what people are worried about. And so they're worried about that. And that's one of the reasons that Cheney is taking such a firm stand, is because the longer this goes on, the more people who are convinced Trump really won that election, the more dangerous they become. And so somebody flashed by and said, they think that Trump is more dangerous now than he was in office, and I'm afraid I agree, which is a terrifying thing on one hand. Now here's the but. Here, no, I'm going to get to the but in a second. The other thing is, of course, that that the Republican legislatures in those states where the Republicans have been taken over by the Trumpers are working desperately hard to restrict the vote. And one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the discussions about H.R. 1, that for the People Act, that for the People Act, there's been a wonderful fact checker on that by the Poynter Institute, which is a very good fact checking place. And the lies about what that law does are myriad, and they're all from the right. And anything that they are going to lie about that thoroughly is suggesting that they're concerned about protecting the vote. And so 43 states, as you know, have introduced legislation to restrict the vote. And it's not all passed yet, but it has passed in a number of states. And they're gonna make it harder to vote. So that's a problem going forward. And then there's also the problem of the census and redistricting, because in those same states, a new study that came out today said that when Republicans redistrict, they give themselves a 9-point advantage in elections. When Democrats redistrict, it does not appear to give them an advantage at all in redistricting in new elections. And that's one of the things that the For the People Act would do, is it would make it illegal to gerrymander the way people are doing. And it's possible, it's very possible to do districts in such a way that you don't offer a leg up to one side or the other. But again, the Republican Party at this point, and again, this is sort of, I was just writing about this, the Republican Party started messing with the electorate back in 1998. We thought of the idea in 86, and back in 1998 started to do it, and then started to rely on gerrymandering. And that has made them rely on it to the point that now it's sort of been set up for the Trumpers to take that over, and people like Cheney sort of are now left out in the cold. They set the system up, and now it's been taken over by these people who are trying to destroy democracy. And it's very, very hard to push back on that, since they now control the party. So in a way, we've been painted into this corner by a generation of malfeasance, and now that's a real problem. Now, that being said, here's the good part, I think. Did I get all these questions? I think I hope I wrapped in, I got 6 questions. I think I wrapped them all in, and I hope this is the case. So, so here's the good news. The Department of Justice has been quite slow for a lot of people when they are handling things like the insurrection and the people being charged with the insurrection. And they've been quite slow to go after former President Trump. And that frustrates a lot of people. I actually think it's extraordinarily smart, because you want these cases to be slam dunk when they come forward. Because again, you're never going to convince the Trumpers. They're going to think till the cows come home that he's been set up, and that he is, this wonderful, divine presence or whatever. Candace Owens had stuff on that the other day. But that's not really who you're looking to convince. You're looking to convince enough people that they can switch these Republicans out of office. Although again, with the extraordinary advantage they have got structurally at this point, it's really worrying. It's really very worrying. So that being said, people asked about what's happening with the January 6th insurrectionists. There have been, I believe it's 400 indictments at this point. Maybe it's 300. And the Department of Justice has said it expects another 100. Well, do you think that they're waiting to go after the little fish? I think not. I think the 100 that are going to come out, not all of them, but I think the big fish are still out there. And already you can sort of see, if you're following this, more and more connections that are going to bring in bigger fish, and I think are going to upset Americans a lot when they see them. So that's a good thing. And then there, in terms of restoring balance and pushing back against the insurrection. And then I think you will also find increasingly the Department of Justice has been looking into things like Giuliani and what happened with Giuliani and Russia. I'm sorry, Rudy Giuliani is Trump's former lawyer and good friend. With Rudy Giuliani and with Russia I'm sorry, Ukraine, but also behind the Ukraine story is the Russia story. There was another dump this morning of documents from that investigation, and they're damning. I mean, they're bad. And I'm not saying that in a legal way. I'm saying that in a historical way, because again, my level of evidence as a historian is going to be different than the level of evidence for somebody in a courtroom. And I'm not making any statements about indictments or anything. But my point is that as these stories come out, I think that I don't think that all of the people who currently seem untouchable are in fact untouchable, and at least by the law. But yes, I think we're in a fraught, terribly dangerous place right now. So so a couple more quick questions here before I get to the end. So this brings up another thing. What about apparently Democrats are asking Justice Breyer to step down, and why would they be doing so? And the answer to that is the Democrats are very aware that in the midterm elections, historically, the party in power loses seats. And because of gerrymandering and because of this weird problem we've got with the Senate, where currently in a 50-50 split, the Republicans represent 40.5 million fewer people than the Democrats do, they're very aware they could lose control of the Congress. And if they lose control of the Senate, that means that if something were to happen to Justice Breyer, the same way something happened to with Bader Ginsburg, there's no way that the Republicans simply would refuse to let anybody else through. And that would, they're hoping to get somebody through while they still have control of the Senate. And I would also point out that I know there's a commission going on to talk about what the future of the Supreme Court, whether it should be expanded or not, and if so, how. I will point out that this idea of holding onto your Senate seat until you're carried out by grim death is a very new one. They used to just change hands, not infrequently, not fast, but people retired. They, when they were fairly young. Remember Sandra Day O'Connor stepped down and lived a lot longer, and certainly Earl Warren, and people did used to retire. It didn't used to be, you used to think that you would do it as sort of as a living, and then you'd get out, and now it seems to go on forever and ever. So that's what's going on with that, and I think I've got all those. So here's another question that people wanted to ask me about, and then I'm going to end somewhere else. And that is, what are my thoughts on Manchin, on Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat of West Virginia? And my thoughts about Joe Manchin are this: Joe Manchin is an amazing politician. He frustrates a lot of people, and he certainly frustrates me because he's insisting he's going to stand on the filibuster. And I think by now you probably know about my thoughts about the filibuster at this point. I'm happy to fill you in if you want me to. But Joe Manchin is a Democrat in a state that went, I believe, 42 points for Donald Trump. I mean, something extraordinary. And that's why it was such a big deal, by the way, when the United Mine Workers switched to support Biden's infrastructure plan, because the miners had been very pro-Trump, and they have switched dramatically. But he's a Democrat, and he stayed in office as the state became increasingly Republican. That's a really big deal. So that being said, of course, right now he's got extraordinary power, because he is sort of that 50th vote, with one exception. Don't forget Arizona's Sinema. And Sinema's just a little odd. Nobody's quite figuring out what she's doing at all. And that's sort of a different question. And it's interesting that people are focusing on him and not on her, because he seems much more the sophisticated politico than she does. But he has been using his, remember I talked about last week about how the point of a Congress critter was in part to do things for the constituents, right? and how I thought it was a problem that our districts have gotten so big that, the average is over 700,000 and it was supposed to be 30,000, or, well, what Manchin does is he brings stuff home to West Virginia. And one of the things that he has been doing in this moment is saying, is cutting deals, saying, I can't come around to this unless West Virginia gets more. And that's what he's supposed to be doing for his constituents. So I know it's really frustrating for people, and certainly it frustrates me, but he stays in office because he delivers for his constituents. And by the way, if you want to know his partner, not literally partner, but somebody like him on the other side is Alaska's Murkowski. Murkowski won with a name like Murkowski. She won in a write-in candidacy. Her constituents liked her so much. She has her own power base, and so does he. So the people who have their own power bases act very differently in Congress. The other one who has his own power base is Romney, because he has a Mormon power base that tends to vote Republican, but the Mormons over time have not liked Donald Trump. So especially Mormon women have organized to oppose Donald Trump. So Romney has a much more secure, independent base than virtually anybody else. And Manchin does the same thing. And Manchin, by the way, for all that he looks like an outlier, he votes Democratic. So Manchin, as frustrated as you get with Manchin, he's actually doing his job. Now, that being said, why does he have so much power? He's got so much power because he's the 50th vote. You want to remove power from Manchin? Make him the 47th vote, get Democrats elected elsewhere in easier spots. And this is one of the things people make, one of the mistakes people make is they go for the people who are most in the news, when you'd be much better off trying to go ahead and replace one of the weaker Republicans with a different Democrat. And then you'd have like Warnock and Ossoff in Georgia. Without them, none of this would be getting through. None of it would be getting through. So that's one thing, if you're interested in acting going forward. The Republicans have identified a number of Democratic seats that they think would be easy to pick off and switch the House of Representatives over to Republican control. And if you want to help out in the midterm elections, find those people, volunteer for those people, send money to those people. And frankly, I didn't know a single name on the list. And I didn't know a single name on the list. They weren't from any states I know very well. And those are, sometimes it's easier to go with the low hanging fruit rather than the most visible fruit. And that, if you think about Manchin, if Susan Collins, and that was a weird thing, but if Susan Collins had been replaced by Sarah Gideon in the 2020 election with a Democrat, Manchin wouldn't matter. So, that's just that's a way to look at that. All right. So, so let me end here with another question that somebody asked, and that is, I'm sorry, Angie just asked, where is the list? And I'm incredibly sorry to say that I look at a lot of stuff in the day, and I don't know where that list was. But I will. I actually won't write about that. I think if you Google it, you know what? I'll make sure it gets out in some fashion. Where can you find the list? I don't know. I gotta look. I'm sorry. All right. So, so the last question I want to leave with is one that somebody asked because they heard me do something the other day about. I'm sorry. I guess I can get into this way. About I did something the other day on the last 100 days. I'm sorry, the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and I think I said that history would see this moment as a turning point. And somebody asked me to say more about that. And as I hope I have made it clear, I am very concerned that that turning point will be the end of American democracy. Things look bad in a lot of ways, and I hope I just outlined them. But I also want to be very clear, things looked really bad in the 1920s for American democracy, when there was also voter suppression and the increasing consolidation of power amongst a very small elite. They also looked very bad in the 1890s, when the situation was very similar. And we had voter suppression to the point that, in fact, we started a whole new system of balloting in order to make sure that you can't vote unless you can read. And then I'm not going to go into that now, but at the time people were like, that's it, democracy is over. And obviously, we had the same issue in the 1850s, where things looked like basically our government was being taken over by a bunch of racist xenophobes who were working in tandem with the very wealthiest Americans to destroy democracy. And I think you could say that in each of the periods I just identified. In each of those cases, America came back. So on the one hand, I'm concerned that what we are looking at historically is, in fact, it's really weird when I write these letters at night, like I'm either writing like, oh my God, it's all over, or look, everything's great. I just sort of feel like I'm split down the middle. It's almost a Manichaean thing. And maybe that's what I'll write about tonight because it's just so weird. But on the other hand, what you are seeing is a complete reworking of the American government to bring us back to the kinds of government that arose in the 1860s under Lincoln, in the early 1900s under Theodore Roosevelt, in the 1950s and 60s under people like Eisenhower and Kennedy, and possibly again now. And what I see is reclaiming of the idea that the government should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And in the 21st century, because of the rise of the internet and because of the rise of globalization and because of the rise of automation, what that means is that the government should respond not simply to the white men to whom it has responded in all the periods I've talked about. Even people like FDR were making the government work largely for men to be able to support their families, but that the government should be responding to all Americans, women and people of color, for the first time fully in our history. That's why, for example, you put childcare into infrastructure, and why you support the caregiving economy, because of course the people who give care in our country are overwhelmingly people of color and women, and it's a reworking of that government in what I think is an incredibly exciting way. And one of the things that is interesting about this moment is, of course, that coming out of the box, Biden passed that giant American Rescue Plan. I think it was, I don't think he expected to get it through in its full state. And the Republicans kind of just, remember they were fighting about Dr. Seuss? It's like, really, guys, there's a bill over here you're not paying any attention to, but whatever. So I think that went through bigger than he expected. And now he's got this jobs plan, this infrastructure bill that, again, I expect he expects it to be cut down, which is why he asked for as much as he did. But that's out there as well. And as I say, I think the Republicans are starting to see the writing on the wall. These are enormously popular bills, and the American people clearly want them. 77% of Americans like the American Rescue Plan, and they like what it's doing. And one of the things that it's doing is it's just pumping American growth. So they're expecting that our growth this year is on track to be 6%. That's large, just so you know. You kind of aim for 3, but you rarely get it. 6%. And similarly, the stock market is very, very strong. And America, what Biden has done with this vaccine rollout is he has demonstrated to the world that the democracies really can work, that the government really can work. And if you look around the world at the authoritarian regimes that have not managed to go ahead and vaccinate their people and are paying so desperately for it now, I think Biden is trying to say, look, is this the government you want? Or do you want the government of Donald Trump? And I think he's making a real gamble. He's not engaging with Trump. He's not engaging with the Trumpers. I think he's making a real gamble that in 2 years, Americans are going to look at where we are and say, yeah, I like this. Let's keep on going this direction. Let's not go back to Donald Trump. And that is, again, one of the things going forward that worries me, in the sense that I think that's what he's thinking. I think that's where he's going. I have faith in the American people. I do worry a lot about what happens to the people who believe the big lie if the rest of us say, nah, we like this. This is a good way to go. Anyway, on that, I'm going to go ahead and let you go and get on with my evening. And thank you for being here. And I will see you on Thursday when we do history. Tomorrow's my last day of teaching for the semester. So I'll have more brain power next Thursday. Thanks for being here.